Good morning. I was wondering what the weather is like today at your place. You know, every day I like to go for a walk, and so when I do, I check the weather outside and then I go to my glove box and I find what kind of gloves do I need. So I've got these kind. They're not really too warm. I haven't worn them very much this winter. And I have these gloves. They're a little bit warmer than those ones I just showed you. I've worn those a few times. And I have these ones that look like the ones I just showed you, but they are much thicker. I've worn these ones a lot. But you know, today when I looked out the window, I thought, oh, it looks cold. And when I checked the temperature, I thought, well, if I go for a walk today, I'm gonna need these gloves. Yeah, it's pretty cold out today. But I haven't shown you my favorite gloves. Do you know what my favorite gloves are? They're these ones. These are gardening gloves, and these are my favorite because I love gardening. But you know, spring is a long ways away, and I'm gonna have to wait. There's nothing I can do but wait until spring gets here. It's hard to wait, but I don't have any choice. Do you know that everybody has to wait for something, and waiting is hard? Now, in the Bible stories that we've been hearing about, we found that the people have such a hard time waiting for God's promises. But you know, I think the reason is because God's promises, they don't come with dates and times attached. They're going to come true, but we just don't know when. So Abraham and Sarah, because they got tired of waiting, they tried to do something on their own and they made a mess of it. But in today's story, which is called The Life of Isaac, we are also going to see that Isaac and Rebekah have to wait, and it's hard. And then they're going to have twins, and they find it very hard to wait too. Waiting is hard. Now, after Sarah died, sometime after Sarah died, Abraham, he married again, and he married a woman called Keturah. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us very much about Keturah, but we do know that Keturah and Abraham had 6 sons. 6. Isn't that amazing? Now, when the sons got older and before Abraham died, he gave them gifts and he sent them away from Isaac. He sent them far away because he didn't want any trouble between them and Isaac. I didn't show you her name. That's her name there, Keturah. And so I'm just going to show you how far away he sent them. Get my map. So Abraham is living way up here in Beersheba, and he sends the 6 sons of Keturah all the way down here into Arabia, and eventually they become the fathers of the Arabian tribes. Now Ishmael, when he was sent away into here, into the wilderness of Paran. So you can see that Abraham's sons are very far away from Isaac. Now, Abraham lived until he was 175 years old. Isn't that amazing? This is Isaac, his son now. Now, when he died, not only Isaac, but his brother Ishmael, the son that Abraham had with Hagar, Ishmael came up from the desert of Paran, and together both of them buried Abraham in the cave that Abraham had bought from the Hittites, and that's the same cave that they had buried Sarah in. So Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham. Now, remember I told you Isaac and Rebekah had to wait too? Well, what did they have to wait for? They also had to wait for a baby. A baby was just not coming. Year after year after year, Rebekah was not pregnant. And so Isaac and Rebekah did not do what Abraham and Sarah did, which was try to fix things for themselves. Isaac waited and he prayed for Rebekah. And he waited and he prayed. He kept waiting and praying, and finally after 20 years, Rebekah became pregnant. Now when you have a baby growing inside you, when the baby gets to be about 4 months old inside of you, he starts to move around, and you can feel maybe a foot moving, or maybe it's doing a somersault. It's quite exciting. But with Rebekah, there was jostling inside, like a lot of it. And she was a little bit frightened. She didn't know what's happening. And so she went to God and she said to God, I don't know what's happening. And you know what he told her? he told her that she was going to have twin sons. And he said, I'm going to bless them both. I am going to make a great nation out of both of them. But one nation will be stronger than the other. And actually, the older son is going to serve the younger son, which seems kind of backwards because in those days, the older son was the one with all the privileges. He became the family leader. But God said that's not the way it's going to be this time. Now, did you know that when we have a question and we don't understand something, God does not mind. In fact, he loves it if we come to him and ask him what we don't understand. And he will answer us. And most often, he gives us an answer right from the Bible, because this is the number one way that God speaks to us. Now, when it came time for the babies to be born, Esau, he came out first. And when he came out, when he was born, he was quite red and he had a lot of hair. They called him Esau. But Jacob was right behind him. And you know, when he was born, he was holding tightly onto the heel of Esau. You know, I don't know, maybe they were having little wrestling matches between themselves before they were even born. I don't know. Now, when Esau grew up, Esau became an outdoors person. He loved to hunt. He became a skillful hunter. And you know, Isaac liked that about Esau, and he liked all of the wild meat that Esau would bring home. And you know, Esau was Isaac's favorite. Now Jacob, he was very different than Esau. He didn't like being outdoors at all. In fact, he liked to stay around the tents, and he was, you know, a creative thinker. He was a schemer, actually. He was always planning something. And he liked cooking. And he was Rebekah's favorite. Now, both these boys would have grown up learning and knowing about what was called the birthright. Now, what the birthright meant was that the oldest son would receive twice as much as anybody else when Isaac died. He would also be the family leader. He would be the one to inherit all of the land that God promised. And he would also be the family from whom Jesus would one day come. This was called the birthright. Now, one day Jacob was out cooking stew, and Esau came in from the field, and Esau was exhausted, and he was starving. And Jacob's stew smelled so good. And he said, Jacob, give me some of that stew. Jacob said, you sell me your birthright first, then I'll give you some stew. Esau was tired and he was rattled. And so he said, you know, what good is a birthright to me? Just give me some of that stew. I don't care. Jacob said, you have to swear to me first that you will sell me your birthright, then I'll give you stew. And so Esau did. He sold his birthright. Everything that God promised, he sold it to Jacob for a pot of stew. He really didn't value God's promises at all. Now, sometime after that, there was a famine in the land, and Isaac had to move from Beersheba to Gerar. And when he got to Gerar, Gerar was like the caravan route that you would take if you were going down to Egypt. But when he got to Gerar, God appeared to Isaac, and he said, Isaac, I want you to stay here in Gerar for a while, and I will bless you. I am going to give you everything that I promised your father Abraham. All of those promises are going to be yours. And so Isaac settled in Gerar. Now remember his wife Rebekah. Rebekah was very beautiful, very beautiful. And so when the men of Gerar started to ask about who's Rebekah, ask about her, Isaac said, she's my sister. Remember, that's exactly what Abraham said about Sarah. He's telling a lie. But Isaac was afraid too. He was afraid because Rebekah was so beautiful that the men would take her and they would kill him first and then take her for themselves. Now one day, the king of Gerar was looking out the window, and he saw that Isaac was laughing with Rebekah, and he was kissing her. And he knew this was not his sister. This was his wife. And so he called in Isaac and he said, what did you say that for? Why did you lie? You know, any one of my men could have taken Rebekah for themselves, and think of all the guilt that you would have brought on us for this. Well, Isaac had to confess that, yes, he was wrong. You know, Isaac needed to trust God to keep him safe, not in his own schemes and plans. Now, that very same year, Isaac planted a crop. And when he went to harvest it, he harvested 100 times more than he planted. 100 times. God is really blessing Isaac. You know, God can do anything. It wasn't just crops that God was blessing Isaac with. It was flocks of sheep. Isaac had hundreds and hundreds of sheep. He had hundreds of goats. He had herds of cattle. You know, he was so wealthy and he had so much stuff that the Philistines, who were the people that lived in Gerar, they were very jealous of Isaac. And so what they did was they went to Isaac's wells and they plugged them full of dirt, every single one of them. These were the wells that Abraham's servants had built and now belonged to Isaac. They filled them all with dirt. So can you see there's just mud in there? And then the king of Gerar came to Isaac and said, look, move away from us. You are a mightier person than us. You're too great. You need to move away from us. Well, you know, Isaac didn't even argue about that. He just moved away into the valley of Gerar. But he worked hard and he restored all of those wells that those herdsmen had stopped up with dirt and made mud. And then Isaac's servants, they built another well. But you know what? The herdsmen of Gerar, they came along and they argued and they said, this is our water. It's not yours. Well, Isaac called that well Esek, which means argument. You know, every well had to have a name. So that when you were taking your flock somewhere, you'd say, well, I'm taking them to the well of argument. They just abandoned that well and they went somewhere else and they dug another well. But you know, the herdsman came along again and said, that's ours. That's our water. That's our well. Well, this time, Isaac called this well Sitnah, which means hostility. They didn't argue. They just moved away to another place and they built another well. You know, but this time, there was no argument. And so Isaac called this well Rehoboth, which means open space. It means the Lord has made space for us. Now, a little while later, the king of Gerar came down to see Isaac. And Isaac said, what are you doing here? He said, you're the one that sent me away from Gerar. Like, why are you here? So the king said, you know, we recognize that God is blessing you. He has given you so much. And we want you to make a pact with us that you won't harm us. Because we sent you away in peace. And we want you to be peaceful towards us. Well, you know what? Even after everything that had happened, Isaac said, I will do that. And so Isaac made a huge feast. And the king of Gerar and Isaac, they exchanged oaths, which are very strong, unbreakable promises, that they would treat each other fairly and live in peace. And you know, just as the feast was concluding, Isaac's servants came up and said, we have dug another well and we have found more water. God just keeps on blessing. So Isaac had a lot of ups and downs in his life, and he's still going to have more. But you know, he's trusting in God, and God is faithful to keep his promises. God is a faithful, promise-keeping God. All right. See you next time.